grave was dug big enough to allow a full-size car to be put in the grave with the person sat in the driver's seat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionists podcast. This week, I am joined by not one, but two guests. We have Dr. Helen Frisby and Professor Stuart Prior. Helen has a PhD from the University of Leeds in Victorian funeral customs. She currently works at the University of the West of England and is author of Traditions of Death and Burial. Professor Stuart Prior has a PhD from Bristol in landscape archaeology and castleology, working at University of Bristol, and he is a former gravedigger. Together, they have researched Bristol cemeteries, looking at how the work of gravediggers shapes the archaeology of modern cemeteries, and they are both currently interested in the implementation of new and alternative burial practices in the UK. So welcome to the show, Helen and Stuart.
Thank you.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being our first duo onto the podcast as well.
An absolute pleasure, Megan. It's great to be here, and we're looking forward to talking with you.
Wonderful. So I guess I wanted to start in the beginning with sort of how the both of you got interested in archaeology and, sort of your individual fields. So how you, Stuart, got interested in landscape archaeology, especially coming from a background as a gravedigger, and then how you, Helen, got interested in funeral customs and the likes as well. So why don't we start with you, Stuart, maybe?
Okay, yeah. So I don't really know. Well, I mean, I do know. I mean, it's a slightly long story, so I'll try and keep it as short as possible. I got injured at work when I was a gravedigger, which is a bit ironic because they said that I would never walk again after the accident, or I might never walk again if I carried on digging graves, which is why I left the grave digging profession. Yeah. So I worked for Yeovil District Council for 6 years as a gravedigger, in the cemetery on Lyde Road, I think it is. But anyway, there's a cemetery in Yeovil that I worked on, and I had an accident at work. People ask me how I'm going to be buried, if I'm going to be buried, and the answer is no. I've already done that once, so I don't want to do it again. So I'll probably be cremated. But essentially, I had an accident at work when I was digging the graves, and I was buried alive, basically. Yeah, the side of the graves collapsed, and I was buried at the bottom of the grave. It was a 6-foot grave, wet weekend over a bank holiday. The grave collapsed in on me, and I was buried underneath the shoring at the bottom of a grave. So it was a bit terrifying. It's a bit ironic that I've come back to looking at graves late on in my career. Yeah, but basically, I went traveling as a result of the accident. And I was traveling for 10 years. And this is before you could phone home. This was before mobile phones. So, I used to have to phone my parents once at Christmas, just to let them know that I was still alive. But I was traveling for 10 years. And basically, through the traveling, I fell in love with archaeology and anthropology. And I decided after a few years that I wanted to come back to the UK and study either to be an archaeologist or an anthropologist. And it was the material culture that really kind of floated my boat. So basically, I got into archaeology as a result of material culture and the things that people leave behind. And then my interest in grave digging is obviously because I was a grave digger, and I realised that the grave digging practice was disappearing fast and being replaced by machine drivers. But we'll come to that later, I guess. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Perfect.
And so what about you, Helen? How did you get interested in archaeology, or, you're more Victorian sort of focused as well, are you?
Oh, how does a nice young lady get interested in death? It's a $60 million question. Well, I don't know. I remember being a teenager when when you sort of thinking about career options at school, and I remember saying to my parents, "I want to be a funeral director," and they took it very well, actually, because all their friends' kids were saying, "I want to be a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor or something sensible." So my parents were actually very supportive, and obviously I didn't end up being a funeral director, as we now know, but I did ironically end up teaching funeral directing quite a few years later. And like Stuart, these things often come around in unexpected ways. And so I went to university. I did a theology degree, but the sort of like the whole patristics and systematics in New Testament Greek didn't really do it for me. And I was really interested in the social history and social anthropology side of things. And I was very lucky to have an inspirational lecturer, Professor Douglas Davis, who later on went on to be my PhD external examiner as well. And so that was a sort of the academic interest in death established. And then during my master's year, when I was writing a dissertation on sort of funeral practices in post-Reformation York, which included a lot of sort of traditional kind of historical documentation type of evidence, but also material culture. So you can sort of see the kind of archaeological, historical thing coming in there. I was actually also nursing my grandma through her last illness, and the funeral was one of those. It was one of those awful, late 90s, early noughties production line crematorium affairs that were so common in the UK at the time. And it was really awful, and it left me thinking that we can do funerals better. Surely we can. And as a historian, I guess it was quite natural to me to think of, well, sort of what inspiration can we take from the past to make funerals better? I went on to do a PhD on Victorian funeral customs, and it was a few years after the PhD, actually, and I was almost at the point of giving up my research for various reasons. And I was helping friends at the Centre of Death and Society in Bath, of which I'm now a visiting research fellow, organise this networking event. And I remember on the evening, I really did not want to go. I was tired, I was fed up. I was thinking, oh, not another networking event. I was tired, I had an awful day at work. And really, I'll be honest, the only reason I went was because I'd helped my friends organise it, and I thought I'd better show my face. And I'm so glad I did. And it was what the late, great Sir Terry Pratchett would have called one of those trousers of time moment, because that's where I met Stuart, and that's where Grave Communications was born.
Yeah, so we didn't meet, we weren't put into a group together. Yeah, so we met during the coffee break. Yeah.
We met over wine and nipples, if I remember
That's
correctly.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I wasn't driving. I was driving, so I couldn't drink, but I was drinking coffee. But essentially,
I was on the bus.
we met, and I was explaining my wish to look at grave communications in terms of grave digging practice, because basically grave digging practice was fast disappearing, and everyone was being replaced by machine drivers. So the old grave digging techniques were not being kind of sort of followed anymore. So I really was interested in kind of capturing that kind of, the last kind of stories of the grave diggers before they just became JCB drivers and not actually understanding the techniques that were done by the old grave diggers. And so I wanted to capture a bit of that. And through doing that, we became really interested in cemeteries. I mean, we always had an interest in cemeteries. As an ex-grave digger, I'd always had, obviously, I couldn't help not be interested in cemeteries. But basically, we went and interviewed all of the grave diggers in Bristol, or a lot of the grave diggers in Bristol, to try and capture some of the kind of work-related aspects of their job. Helen, you describe it well in terms of law and law. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'd also before I say that, also to say that we spent some time in the archives as well, because to try and get some historical perspective on it, and to try and build up this picture over time. And yeah, I think where I was coming at it from was that obviously there's some law LAW around cemeteries and burial. We'll probably come back to that a bit later on, I imagine. But I've always been interested in sort of lore, as in LORE. My PhD worked with historic antiquarian sources or folklore. So I was sort of quite well aware that there was probably going to be this whole kind of informal occupational culture out there. So the tools, the techniques, the verbal expressions, the time when narratives that say something about what people's values and priorities. And so yes, when Stuart sort of said he was interested in researching cemeteries, this was absolute music to my ears. And I think part of being a researcher as well is it's not just about having the interest in common. You have to have that very human, we can work together moment as well. So, which I think we did at that event, and here we are.
Yeah. 10 years later, we're still going. Yeah, trying to make a new stream to the project. Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've only been talking to you for 30 minutes and I can already tell you seem to be like a perfect match for working together.
Yes, yeah, we work together well.
We do. I think we're quite different in some ways, but in ways that complement one another. And I think certainly when we talk to the grave diggers, because Stuart is very sort of obviously one of them and has done the job and was able to talk to them in that way. Whereas I was very sort of clearly the nice young lady from the university who had a license to ask the silly questions. And can you just tell me again what number 2 shovel does, sort of thing. So between us, we were able to capture quite a wide range of questions.
So part of the paper that you wrote on the gravediggers and part of the project that involved interviewing them was talking about sort of the changes in how grave digging has been over the years, especially now, as you say, that they're moving more towards machinery and stuff. So with the move towards machinery, is there still a place for the manual digging of a grave, or is that going to be gone entirely? Sort of how has it changed over the years and where is it going? Do you know?
You can't replace it entirely because when you've got an old cemetery, the gravestones are too close together. So you can't get a JCB between the headstones. If you've got a 6-foot gap or, 7-foot gap, it's not big enough for you, unless you've got a mini digger, to get a JCB in. When you're thinking about modern cemeteries, you get a headstone and a footstone. So you've got a 12-foot space, basically, between these lawn cemeteries these days. So they're basically designed around the machine now, rather than being traditional layouts in terms of lawn cemeteries. Yeah. So they've actually changed the way that the cemeteries even are laid out, because they are basically focused around the machine itself now.
Yeah. And when we looked in the archives, we actually found minutes of the burial board where they discussed this, and as Stuart said, the sort of the priorities shifted. This was in the sort of 1950s and 60s, so it's very much about efficiency and safety rather than the aesthetic of the older style garden cemeteries.
It was interesting.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Go on, Megan. So when I was when I was in Yeovil, we actually had an away day to Bournemouth, one of the Bournemouth lawn cemeteries, where they had machines, and they were asking us whether or not we could use machines, JCBs, within the cemetery in Yeovil. And actually the answer was no, because in the Victorian parts of the cemetery, the headstones are just completely too far together. So you can't get a machine down the row in order to dig the grave. So, it's impossible. But in modern cemeteries, they've changed the landscape so that they can accommodate the machines.
Yeah. I think that said, we also did find that the history of mechanisation of grave digging went back a bit further than we thought. So we found, for example, that in Bristol, at least, it'd be interesting to see whether this is the same in other areas. but actually the first mechanical drills were used in the 1930s. Because I think one of the cemeteries locally, they'd bought this piece of land. They'd had protracted negotiations throughout the 1920s, finally got this bit of land, and they got a few foot down and discovered it was solid bedrock. And the traditional sort of pickaxe and dynamite method wasn't going to be usable because of the extent of the issue. So some bright spark suggested, well, why don't we borrow a few drills from the roads department? And that's how mechanisation started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the problem with the pickaxe and explosives, because literally they used to put explosives, they used to put dynamite into the graves and actually blow the bedrock apart.
They did.
That's all well and good, apart from the health and safety aspects that I think people would raise their eyebrows about nowadays.
I was just thinking, I was like, I don't think that's very safe.
Exactly. But also, the neighbours around the cemetery complain about the noise. Yeah, you can imagine.
They do. They do. I found
blowing up graves.
I found this. I found this correspondence in the burial board files, and it was this chap in the 1920s. His house kind of sided on to one of the Bristol cemeteries. And he complained that the vibrations from the blasting operations in the cemetery were undermining the foundations of his house. This goes on over several monthly burial board meetings. You see this saga kind of developing, and somebody from the burial board actually has to go out and be in this guy's house with him while the explosion's taking place. And the conclusion is, and anybody who's ever sat on a committee anyway can just read the exasperation between the lines. The conclusion was this guy was trying it on a bit, to get the compensation, but it does kind of illustrate the impact, like Stuart says, it would have had on the neighbours, whether real or imagined.
Mm-hmm. Loud bangs coming from the cemetery. It's explosives, not the dead rising up. Yeah?
Yes.
I can envision some archaeologists who would definitely take a stick of dynamite if you gave it to them.
Well, right up until the 1960s, actually, the having that skill of being able to do that with explosive, it was regarded as a very specialist task, and gravediggers got paid extra for doing it, for having that
being
responsibility.
The explosives expert.
Yeah. Absolutely. So again, when we're talking about the informal occupational culture, it gives us a little insight into what it was like to work at a cemetery at that time, and the kind of the hierarchies and the dynamics and so on.
Yeah, I had never really thought about like it being a hierarchical structure.
Oh, absolutely.
I would have thought like everyone's on the well, at least when it comes to gravediggers, like everyone's on the same level.
No,
definitely not.
No, you had in sort of the old world, you had the gardeners, and then you had who maintained the grounds, and then you had the grave diggers who had that sort of specialist skill, and then sometimes the gardeners would help out when it was busy or a grave digger was off sick or something like that. And then quite often you can sort of track it through the minute books that quite often then they would get promoted up to grave digger. Yeah, I even found some hints that they had what were called lady sextons as well at some cemeteries. So this would be somebody who would not be doing the heavy manual work, but would be responsible for, sort of watering the flowers and greeting visitors and that sort of things that it was considered appropriate for a lady to do. So this is all in the pre-war world, of course. It's changed a lot now.
Makes sense as a kind of female hosting position, even in a cemetery.
Oh, it's a very, very gendered world, even now. It really is.
It's one of those things, actually, I'm just checking my own bias now, that like when I think gravedigger, I do think man, which that's on me. That's probably bad.
There were a few well-known, because they are unusual, female gravediggers. Yeah,
particularly during the First World War.
One of which was related, I think, to one of our friends, Lindsay. Right?
That's right, yes.
Wasn't she a grandmother or an auntie or something? Great auntie.
Great aunt,
great
I
aunt
think.
who was a female
But, yeah.
gravedigger.
But yeah,
they're unusual.
There were a few of them, particularly during the war, when obviously there were labour shortages, like in any occupation, and women stepped, in this case, quite literally into the breach. But as Stuart says, they're perhaps more remarkable for being unusual.
That makes sense. It is a very labour-intensive job, I would think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Having done the job myself for 5 or 6 years, it's really hard to explain. It's a very physical job, yeah. But there is a technique to it. Digging an initial grave, there is a technique that there's basically a grave template. So you've got a big piece of wood that you lay down that's kind of the shape of a coffin, but slightly bigger. And basically you try to cut the hole to that template shape. Yeah. And that's all very well and good at the top. So basically every now and again you get the template and you just make sure that it will go down the sides of the grave. So, basically if it will make sure that it will fit. Because what you don't want is something called a sticky coffin. Because obviously the horror of the relatives, if the coffin gets stuck halfway down the grave cut, the last thing you want is for that family to have to suffer. They've just lost their relative or their father or mother. The last thing you want is for that coffin to get stuck halfway down the grave itself. So you have to make sure that it will fit. So you basically just keep constantly checking to make sure that you're digging it big enough. And the problem is that when you're down at the bottom, you look up, it looks like it's going to fit, but you can never be sure. So you're constantly measuring and checking all the way down to make sure that coffin. And one of the jobs that we used to get given, which probably we shouldn't have done, but we did, was to go and actually we phone in the undertaker. What size is the coffin going to be? Because obviously the size of the coffin dictates the size of the burial hole. So we'd have to phone the undertaker. Very often they'd be really busy, if they got a rush on. Sounds ridiculous, but after bank holiday, more people die on bank holidays than normal because people do things that they would not normally do and then end up dead in one way or another, cutting a hedge or, chopping through the wire or falling off a ladder. People do things unusually on bank holidays. So there'd be a rush. And this is why in the cemetery world, we'd always have 1 or 2 holes dug in before the bank holiday to account for the bank holiday rush. But basically, very often we'd have to go down to the crematorium or the funeral directors and actually just, measure the body. Yeah, now I'm sure that wouldn't happen today. Sure that that's absolutely not done anymore. But we'd go down and measure the body, so then we could figure out what size the coffin would be. Then we could actually ascertain whether the grave is big enough or not. Right. Some of the graves, the military graves, are absolutely huge because they use caskets. And if you put a coffin in a casket and then you need to bury the casket, they're enormous. So you're digging, much more earth than you would normally. But you can get huge coffins being buried. And sometimes it takes an awful lot of effort to dig these huge holes. But there's nothing like being down the bottom of a 6'3" hole. 6'3" is the kind of new for 2. So basically, they used to dig them 12 feet deep. Yeah, I can't imagine. Well, I've been to the bottom of a 12-foot hole. Yeah, not very often you do that anymore because it's so dangerous. Health and safety wise, they don't let you dig those depths anymore. So they're all burials these days are normally what they call new for 2s. Yeah, so for 2 people. So you're digging a 6'3" hole, and then the second burial goes in at 4'3", 4'4". Yeah, so 2 people in that grave. But if you dig down to the bottom of a 12-foot hole, it's a very deep hole. And all you can see above you is this patch of coffin-shaped sky. That's the terrifying bit. I'm glad when the grave collapsed on me and I had that accident at work, I wasn't down a 12-foot hole, so I very much doubt that it got me out in time to save my life. Yes.
That whole theme of of being prepared for any eventuality. That when we reviewed our transcripts afterwards and we looked at the historical evidence as well. Right through all the stages of the process, from when somebody first comes to the cemetery and says, "I'd like to by a plot. So they get walked around, but they'll steer them towards certain areas of the cemetery, and that whole theme of being prepared for every foreseeable eventuality, like Stuart says about making sure that the hole's big enough, often digging out a bit of extra just to be on the safe side, making sure you don't get sticky on the day, making sure that it's safe, that it's bailed out if it's been raining or whatever. This whole theme of being prepared and of keeping the show on the road, if you like, is really, really core to what they do, and it's very important to them. And our gravediggers told us lots of what I as a historian and folklorist would call time when narrative. So they tell you about the time when something happens, and really they're telling you about something that is important to them in their professional lives.
A couple of examples of the time when the coffin fell out the back of a car on the
Mm-hmm.
day. Yeah, when they dropped the
Mm-hmm.
coffin by accident, when the coffin got stuck in the grave. So you get all these
Yeah.
kind of narratives that they're wanted to tell you. But by the same token, they were quite careful in what they told us, because obviously they didn't want to get into trouble with their employer. Yeah. So they were like very cagey, especially more with Helen than me. I'd done the job, so I could kind of knew what they were talking about. But very often
you could go places I couldn't, and in fact, literally, you could go places I couldn't, because if you remember, they let you into the tool sheds to look at the tools, but they were quite uncomfortable with the idea of me doing that.
I still don't know why, but yes,
I think it was partly that. It was partly that sort of reputational awareness, which again is another very strong professional value. But I think it was also, again, partly it's a very, as we said, it's a very gendered kind of work. It's a very, what you might call, hyper masculine kind of work culture. I mean, it did mean, like I said, I could perhaps just ask the silly questions and clarify points, and I could maybe go into a little bit more of the sort of emotional aspects of the work.
What was interesting as well was that there were phrases that the Bristolian gravediggers had that down in Yeovil they didn't have. So they'd tell me something and I'd be like, what are you talking about? And then they'd have to explain it in really big detail. And I see what you mean now. I know what you mean now. But yeah, there was some really interesting Bristolian phrases that were given to me. And I'm like, what on earth are they talking about? You'd be like, they're trying to explain something, and I just had no idea what they were going on about, But, it was kind of language barriers rather than, rather than not understanding what they were trying to tell me.
I think one of the interesting things about the next stage of our project will be, because the next stage we're planning is to replicate this research around, well, we're doing it by legal jurisdiction, so around England and Wales, will be to find out what aspects of the sort of the practices we've recorded are specific to our pilot study area and which are shared more widely.
Yeah, so you were talking before as well about the law, LAW, surrounding all of this as well. And I had never really thought about there being laws in places to how, health and safety, yes, of how to dig a grave. I understand that there would be laws around that, but how the grave has to be, the size and shape and depth and all of that, or how a cemetery needs to be laid out or anything like that.
Yes and no. I think it's very telling that the first ever piece of burial legislation in this country is the 1666 Burial in Woolens Act. Nothing to do with how to manage a cemetery efficiently or safely or respectfully. It's to do with protecting the English woolen industry, and that absolutely sums up the attitude to burial legislation in this country until very recently, because what we've got is a patchwork of mainly 19th century with some 1970s in there as well, laws that's quite, it's quite sort of, it addresses some things and not others. The attitude from central government has always been very much that it's a problem for local authorities to deal with, and they don't really want to touch it. And in some ways, that's that's actually a good thing, because local authorities are perhaps in a better position to respond to the needs of their local communities. But at the same time, it does also dispose, if you will pardon the pun, of a otherwise very politically and economically tricky problem onto local authorities. Thankfully, that's changing now. The government are starting to get in fact, they've already done it in Scotland. They've got a real hold of this centrally now and recognise that actually it needs to be addressed at national level.
And the government are just conducting a survey of all the burial authorities in this country. Yeah, so that is literally happening as we speak. Yeah,
Indeed,
in
and
fact,
we've contributed towards that.
Yeah, the results of the survey are going to be published in the next few weeks.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Good timing.
So absolutely. And we're hoping that we, as part of the sort of next stage of our work, we're going to be speaking to the Law Commission, I think later this month actually, on sort of making sure that the next stage of our research is useful for them. So we're right in there with the forefront of it all.
And basically, the legislation at the moment kind of covers the layout of cemeteries, the depth of the graves, the health and safety around graves, the depth at which bodies should be buried. There is a level at which you don't want to have a burial too close to the surface. Now, I would have said, if you'd asked me this 2 weeks ago, that it would be because animals would dig up the body, and it would be interfered with foxes and badgers. But we've just spoken to somebody from Natural Death, and they said that there are very few incidents of this happening. So actually, it's almost certainly to do with the smell that dead bodies produce. So, basically, you've got to have a certain amount of soil between the dead body and the surface, so that you're cutting out that element of kind of disturbance and the smell that gets produced by bodies.
You see, this whole question of grave depth fascinates me, because with my historian hat on, I'm sat here thinking, if you go back to the Middle Ages, say, graves were only, foot and a half deep. They were a lot shallower. And in fact, they wouldn't be pre-dug before the funeral like they are nowadays. They would have been dug in front of the congregation. So necessarily they were a lot shallower. And it also, I think, meant that, we're getting into some sort of technicalities of decomposition now, but it also meant that at those kind of higher levels, you get more sort of aerobic respiration and decomposition, so that the body decomposes quickly, and then you're left with bones which can then be removed into a charnel house or an ossuary, and then the space can be reused. And that is how medieval churchyards for centuries actually kept on recycling their burials. It's also why you don't find really a whole lot of medieval graves.
And one of the things that we're looking at the moment is the burial crisis. If you speak to the local authorities, there is, according to them, only about 20 years worth of burial space left in English cemeteries. Yeah, we're literally running out of space.
Yeah. And in fact, some London authorities, and Tower Hamlets springs to mind as one of them, they've actually already run out. So they're having to ship their dead who would have wanted to be buried locally. They're having to ship them off to other outer London boroughs at great expense, obviously. So it's already happening in real time.
This all comes about because the government thought that they tackled the issue with burials by introducing crematoriums, and they thought that everybody would want to be cremated, and therefore that ends the burial crisis. Yeah. But
and that is why they introduced the new for twos that Stuart was talking about earlier, because there was this expectation that cremation would eventually become universal, except
only about 2/3 of the population want to be cremated, right? So if 1/3 of the population want to be buried in a cemetery, you've got to find space for that 1/3 of the population. And nobody, the problem is you've got the NIMBY squad, basically the general public, and I'm not, but essentially not many people are comfortable having a cemetery built next to their house, right?
Mm.
So if the local authority comes and says, we're going to build a cemetery on this plot of land, and you've got neighbours that are like, we don't want a cemetery in a crematorium near our house, that's going to devalue the property, blah, blah, blah. So people are very kind of anti having cemeteries built. So if we're not going to build new cemeteries, we need to make sure that we can reuse the cemetery space that we already have. Yeah. And this is one of the issues. Helen was talking about ossuaries and charnel houses. One of the things that I would love to see a brave local authority reintroduce is that idea of charnel housing or ossuaries, right? So if we could get graves to be like going back to the medieval period where you could actually take the bones out of the grave that, so basically the thing is as well, we've got this Victorian ideal that you buy a grave in perpetuity, right? So forever, right? But that completely was never true and isn't true, right?
Yeah.
You rent
it's
that
a very
cemetery
recent
space.
thing.
You rent that cemetery space for about 20 to 25 years, according to most local authorities. In some, it's a bit longer. In some, it's a bit shorter. But you only ever had rights to bury a body in that piece of land. You don't own that plot, right? So essentially, you've got a problem where people think they own that space and they can do whatever they want with it. They can put whatever headstone they want. They can put whatever flowers they want, whatever memorial. They can't. Actually, it's a carefully controlled environment, because it needs to look and be respectful and be respected as a cemetery. That's another problem we have with the grave diggers. But anyway, we've got a situation where we're running out of space and we need to do something fairly urgently in terms of burial space.
Yeah, I think Stuart's right, and if you look at history, certainly it tells us that just building more cemeteries is only kicking the can down the road, because the Victorian solution to their burial space crisis in the 1840s, 50s, 60s was to build cemeteries on what was then the outskirts of town. And I always think it's really interesting to look at a map of Bristol and look at this sort of ring of cemeteries dotted around. And what you're looking at is the boundaries of the city in about the 1870s. Of course, what's happened since is that the city's grown up and around it. So that solution I talked about earlier of, we'll just buy some more land and add it on. And that still goes on, actually. In rural settings, it's still perfectly possible just to buy more land and keep expanding. But in a city, often the city's grown up and around the cemetery, so it's got nowhere to go. So arguably, if we build a new layer of cemeteries, we're just, as I say, we're just kicking the can down the road. So I think, like Stuart says, we need a kind of a more radical solution, and that kind of going back to the deep past might be a
interestingly
a way forward.
Interestingly, they don't have this problem in Europe, right? Because they've got a different method of, unfortunately, what we call disposal of the remains. Yeah, I mean, if you think about America or Europe, you've got I've forgotten the name of the tombs that are in walls, Helen. You know, where you get the coffins that are put into walls. Yeah, so you've got a little door on the front of each one.
I know the sort of thing you mean.
I know what you mean, but I don't know the name of it either.
Yeah, I don't know if there is a technical name for it, but whatever they're called, yeah, you get these burials where you put people in the wall, yeah, and then in places like Greece, the next step once that space is no longer being paid for, is you take that body out of that space that you've stored it in for the last 20, 25, 50, if the relatives are still alive. It can be a long time, but basically you then move them to an ossuary, yeah, or a charnel house, and then, that's the solution, yeah. So, you can still go and visit the remains, but they'd be in a kind of bigger public space where other people might be as well. So in Europe, that's quite common, but in the UK, it's uncommon. We don't do that. So we've got this. We've kind of created this problem in this country.
So it will require quite quite a culture shift.
A step
And
change,
because it's
as they say.
absolutely, and of course, because it's such an emotive topic, sometimes it can be a bit uncomfortable being at the forefront of this. I've actually just come tonight from helping to run a death cafe here in Bristol, where we've been talking about this sort of thing, and it generates some very strong emotions, shall we say?
If people think they've got
Yeah,
that
'cause
plot forever, and then they realise that they don't, it can be, quite shocking for them that they don't realise they realise that they haven't purchased that space from the council. They're renting that space from the council.
And I think that's compounded because, earlier we talked about the fact that burial authorities are very concerned with their public reputation. Although they've got all these rights to reclaim and reuse graves, in practice they tend not to use them because politically it's really out there.
yeah, definitely. I know that people have been talking about, not only that we're running out of room with the way that we currently bury people, but also that burials and cremations are bad for the environment as well. And if we're considering, the longevity of our planet, having green, empty spaces with like stones on them is not a great use of space. And then burning fossil fuels to cremate people is not a great use of fossil fuels. And then also, we're running out of room in an ever expanding urban landscape. So there's a lot that goes into it. But yeah, it is one of those things that I feel like we are going to need to have a drastic shift very soon.
It's a bit ironic, but our medieval ancestors, may well have had the perfect solution,
Yeah. They were a lot better at this stuff than we are, I think. I think it's I wonder if future historians will look back on this period of time in terms of our burial practices in this country as perhaps a bit of a blip. Because,
yeah, it's a interesting topic to try and explain to maybe people who aren't in the know as well, to be like, so the medieval people used to dig you back up and we're saying that was a good thing and we should go back to that. So how do you feel about if we dig you up in a few years?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously though, if you think about what happens in places like Eastern Europe, that's completely common practice. People are not as afraid of death as we seem to be in the UK. Yeah. They were quite happy to kind of, dig their ancestors up, or even have them, like in Sicily, put in areas where they can be mummified. You can actually go to Sicily and go and visit. If you were Sicilian, you could go and have a picnic with your dead grandfather. We would think of that as ludicrous in this country, but in Sicily, that was, until the 1970s, that was done fairly commonly. You would literally meet your ancestors in the flesh, even though they passed away. So, our idea of what death and what constitutes death is very different to most other countries, to be fair.
Yeah, and I think to most of the past as well. And I guess maybe Stuart and I have a slightly different perspective on this because we move in worlds where discussing all this stuff is perfectly normal.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have a lot of colleagues who are also involved in this kind of research and discussions. And we have great conferences, by the way, I will say, because it's always great to meet colleagues and you don't have to explain why you're interested in death. But yeah, it's I think for me in sort of recent years, I've started doing a lot more kind of talks to the general public, death cafes and so on. And it's been a sort of really interesting reminder that perhaps outside these very particular academic circles, actually, these are very contentious and emotional issues still.
Yeah, I guess we need to treat it with a bit, we need to treat it with respect when we're talking to the general public, rather than, joke about death and burial, because a lot of people can get very offended when you're talking about their ancestral remains. Yeah. So we need to be a little bit more kind of,
I think something we kind of got a hint of in our, although as you say, Stuart, the Gravediggers were a bit careful with this, but we still got a hint, didn't we, that they had their own kind of like internal mess room humour, as it were. And in a way, as an academic who studies these perhaps slightly taboo subjects, I could identify with that. Actually, it's a coping mechanism, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. If you've, one of the things that I had to do when I was a gravedigger was to exhume bodies, I only did a few of them, fortunately, but it's very unpleasant to have to exhume a body. Some of the ones that I did were suspected murder victims. Yeah, as in the person had two previous partners, and then the third one died in suspicious circumstances, and they thought they better exhume the previous two partners to see whether or not they were poisoned. Yeah. And actually it turned out that they were. And the person was sent to prison as a result of poisoning 3 of his ex-partners. Yeah. So that's one of the ones I had to do. But when you do it extra, but the thing is that even that practice has now changed because it was very rare. But actually recently it's become, I wouldn't say common, but it's become more accepted, more usual to actually exhume your partner or grandparent and actually move them with you when you move house to a different county. So actually there are people now requesting exhumations be done on their loved one so that they can be moved to the cemetery near to their new home. So actually that's just become a lot more, it's become more common.
Yeah, and the Home Office, which grants the license for an exhumation, operates on sort of what's called a permissive basis. So the assumption is the license will be granted unless there's a reason not to. Where it can get a bit stickier is when someone is buried in either a churchyard or in a consecrated section of a cemetery. Because the Church of England is still the presumption is still very much against exhumation. Although if you're a reader of the Church Times, you will see, and interesting enough, I've seen more and more cases coming up recently where people have been going through the consistory court and even to the Court of Archers to sort of because they want someone exhumed for the kind of reasons that Stuart, social reasons, if you like.
And that kind of ties in completely with the title of your channel, the Resurrectionists. It's completely about resurrection. The reason why they want them to stay in the ground is because they're waiting for the resurrection, and that's the whole point that the Victorians had. The whole point was that they were laying there in that lovely cemetery waiting to be resurrected on Judgment Day, if people are going to be shifting bodies about, it gets a bit more confusing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize people were moving houses, furniture, and their dead relatives.
Indeed, you can now take Great Auntie Edith with you if you so wish.
Something that I didn't realise until this week, just gone, is, and this was new to me, and I think new to Helen as well, although we kind of knew it in the back of our minds, that you can be buried in your garden if you own the house. Yeah.
Yes.
So where we've always thought of, bodies, we always thought that bodies had to be buried in municipal cemeteries or, private family crypts. Yeah. But I didn't realize that actually if you owned a property, so we were speaking to somebody from Natural Death this week, and they said, no, it's always been the law that actually, you don't have to go with the local authority. The reason that we tend to go with local authorities is because the funeral directors tend to steer people away from being buried in their back gardens because they want the business to go to the cemetery, right? So, sorry, if I'm, I don't mean to put people's...
I think the thing again, we said about burial law, LAW in this country, is it's quite fragmentary. It's often quite instrumental to address a specific, often quite local or regional problem. So the presumption of law is always that I hope no lawyers are listening again and are going to write you letters about this, Megan. But as a rule, the principle is that something is allowed unless it's explicitly prohibited. And as Stuart says, burial on your own property is not of itself explicitly prohibited
So
by
the
law.
one that
Obviously, there are health and safety and environmental considerations, but it's seen as a safety or an environmental consideration, not as a moral principle, if you like.
The one that immediately springs to mind is Ozzy being buried in that private estate next to his lake. The thing is, as long as it's not going to affect the water table, that's the thing that you've got to think about. The ability to bury in that soil, as in, whether it's what sort of bedrock it is and what the water table is, then in theory, if you own the property, that you want to bury the person on, and you don't have a mortgage on it because then it's owned by the bank rather than you. You can actually be buried on that plot of land. So actually people could choose to be buried in their back gardens. The only thing you then have to do, unless I know, I don't know the full implications of this, but I think you've got to add the burial in your garden to the deeds of your house, so that if somebody buys the property, they know that there's a dead body in the garden. So
Obviously, what it will do to your house price, and also, interesting enough, you've really got to do some sort of thinking through your future plans here, because then, of course, if you ever leave that property, you won't then have access rights to it. So you really got to think this through. But I think it ties in more broadly with this, and again, it's sort of like a modern funerary folklore that you have to do this and you have to do that, and you have to use a funeral director, and you have to have a body on. Actually, no, you don't. You don't. It's convention. And most people in practice, and having had a recent big bereavement myself, I can tell you, absolutely, when you're in a position of making these, and it's like the ultimate distress purchase, isn't it? A funeral. It's often easier to have some kind of lines to follow. And as Stuart said, it's certainly in the funeral director's interest to guide you along those lines. But actually, you need do none of this. And there's a whole, over the last sort of 20 years, it's been great to see a whole kind of alt-death movement springing up of independent funeral celebrants and arrangers and so on, or who will facilitate you doing as much or as little as you want yourself.
And if you're interested in going down that route, then natural death have, even guidance on digging your own grave. Or getting somebody to dig your grave for you. So that there's guidance out there in terms of how you dig your grave, where it can be dug. So basically, if you're interested in that, in a kind of home funeral and being buried in your own piece of land, then actually natural deaths have that covered now. So.
I think probably what I would say is if that is something which interests anybody who's listening, have a think about it now. Don't leave it until the moment, because it takes a lot of energy and a lot of will to go against the system. So think it through. Tell your relatives who are going to be organising your funeral and disposal what you want.
It's I actually did look into the laws in Ireland as well. I had a hyper focus a couple of years ago about my own funeral, because that's a fun thought. But when I was looking into it, we have a similar thing where you can be buried in your own back garden. But again, it's potential contamination is mainly what they're worried about. And also if there's any indication that there's going to be an infrastructure shift and that you might get dug up in the next couple of years, that they also worry about. But usually it's for farmers and stuff, I think, people who the land will be generationally in the family and they don't need to worry about resale. But we also have burial at sea. But apparently that's really hard to get permission for after you've died. So it's one of those like preemptive, if you want to get buried at sea, get permission now, because it won't work after you've died.
It's very, very expensive, and there are only, I think, 2 places in the UK where you can do it. So it might or might not be practical. And there are certain rules about how you can then embalm the body and all sorts of things like that. So again, it's something, if it's somebody is wanting to look into that, it is best done while he's still here.
And the problem with burial at sea is the fact that you've got no idea where the coffin might end up. So that's
Yeah.
another thing to bear in mind. If you're happy to be for your relative or ancestor to be a world traveller, that's great. But basically, sometimes the coffins do unfortunately float to shore. So that does occasionally happen. And so the reason why it's so expensive is that they've got to take the body in the coffin quite a way out to sea before they launch you out into the ocean. Yeah.
So
Hopefully
for
you won't
example,
come back.
if you had lots of happy childhood holidays, I don't know, like Scarborough, just to pick somewhere random, you can't just go and be buried in the North Bay. You've got to go to these specific places.
Out to sea. Yeah. It's not. It's out in the middle of the ocean rather than somewhere near the coast, because otherwise you're at the risk of washing ashore, and they don't want that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why I picked Scarborough, so sorry to anyone from Scarborough who's listening. I just thought of that because that was where we went on holiday when I was a child.
So obviously, as we've said, there needs to be a sort of culture shift in how we perceive burials and things. Is there any ways that you think maybe it could be presented to the public, or anything we can do to kind of help the public kind of acknowledge what the problem is and come to terms with why there needs to be this shift to kind of get on board with it?
I can go with this a bit if you like, Stuart.
Well, I was just going to say, actually, before you do that, I was just going to say that the government they've just finished that. They're just finishing that paper about death and burial. Then they're literally going to start another one about funerary arrangements. Yeah. So the government are also looking at how people choose to get buried. So that is something that is going to happen very soon. Yeah. But go for it, Helen.
Well, actually, Stuart, it follows on really nicely because I was going to say that we're talking at the moment so we've done our pilot and written that up and had a bit of a hiatus for various reasons. And then we're now talking to the government and to lots of other potential stakeholders as well about how we can sort of reflect and build in their interest to the next stage of our project, which, as I said earlier, should look at things across England and Wales. These are certainly the kinds of questions which we anticipate being built into the next phase. The pilot was very much, I think, about, because at the time we did this research, the pilot research, nobody had spoken to the guys who actually do the job. People had spoken to people who run and use cemeteries in all sorts of capacities, but nobody has spoken to the guys that's in the job. So that in itself was quite new and radical. We didn't know if they're even going to talk to us. And now we've got that proof of concept. Then the next stage is talking to these various agencies to find out what they want from our work and building that in.
And one of the things we recently discovered is that not only have you got cemetery operatives and grave diggers that are working in these municipal cemeteries, but you've also got a whole host of grave diggers that are working doing private burials. So actually one of the things we want to do is to interview those guys as well to see what their burial practices are like. And I hadn't even considered that before. I was just thinking about municipal cemeteries. That was the way that, most of us are programmed to think about death and burial. But actually, there's a whole, I don't want to say alternative, there's a whole part of our culture that currently I haven't even considered. And actually, I think we need to kind of look at more detail at how these kind of natural cemeteries are dealing with death and burial, because that might be a way of kind of, at least taking some of the pressure off the municipal cemeteries, and not everybody has to be buried via the council or in a church cemetery.
I said earlier about how sort of my research was very much what lit the fire under my research right at the start was attending this very sort of identikit production line kind of funeral. So it's actually really, really exciting to be involved in some research that might help change that.
Yeah. So it's just interesting to me as I was reading through your paper as well, because obviously you're talking to people who are currently working as grave diggers, and you're looking at, how this is going to impact like archaeologists in the future for like how our graves are laid out, and obviously, how the practice now is changing and evolving over time because of, machinery and all of that. But reading through it, it kind of also dawned on me I'd never thought of the gravedigger in the past as well. Like because I've dug graves before, I think of the person in the grave. I think of the family and the friends and the community who buried them. I think of what's in their grave with them. I think of all of that, but I never actually thought of the person who may have dug the grave as well, who may have been completely separate from all of that.
It was quite nice when I was looking at the archives. It was quite nice to, sort of meet, even if in a very limited way, some of the sort of the characters who came off the pages. And the one I always remember is George Jones, he was a gravedigger at, I think it was Greenbank Cemetery here in Bristol back in or it might have been Avon View actually, back in the 1870s. And there's this sort of run of minutes where he's repeatedly asking for an increase in his wages, because at the time gravediggers were paid by the piece. And then there's this one-liner in the minute books. And again, if you've ever sat on a committee of any kind, you can read a lot into this. It was reported that George Jones had thrown up the work. So you sort of, your imagination goes off, so you're thinking, well, what happened? Did he just throw down his shovel and storm out one day?
I've had enough. Yeah, I've had enough.
Yeah. Haven't we all dreamed of doing that?
Yeah. So, hang on. My computer's fritzing out on me. So, in your research of chatting to these gravediggers as well, is there anything you sort of came across that surprised you or was a part of the process, or maybe what would be left behind to be seen by archaeologists that you hadn't really considered before?
I guess one of the things that we thought was really interesting is that the grave diggers actually have quite a lot of power over what goes into the grave. So not what's in the coffin, that's completely the person that goes into that, obviously the family's wishes are respected. Yeah. So basically the person who picks the clothes that they're going to be buried in, what they're going to have in their pockets, the sorts of things that they want in the coffin with them, jewelry or whatever. If they're not cremated, then obviously they can choose what they're going to be buried in. Yeah. One of the things that was interesting to me as a former gravedigger and as an archaeologist was actually the things that the gravediggers were removing when they felt that they would be health and safety risks for future gravediggers, right? So, for example, if people had thrown in bottles of spirits, if people had thrown in even cannabis, spliffs and stuff were thrown into graves occasionally. So people were kind of, throwing stuff in that they thought that the person that liked to be, the sorts of things that would go into the grave for that person, so that if that person wanted, a cigarette or whatever, so people are leaving kind of offerings or throwing offerings into the grave. And we've one of the things that was surprising is that actually the gravediggers themselves were curating that material culture and actually removing things that they thought were going to be a risk to the future gravediggers. So if there were bottles of whiskey thrown in, they'd actually remove that. They wouldn't drink them because obviously they cut that. They'd actually realise that these are from people's loved ones, so they'd put them away, or they wouldn't. But basically they'd remove them so they wouldn't cause a risk to future gravediggers. So actually that was an interesting kind of snippet. In actual fact, the gravediggers themselves are creating the material culture, not only that goes into the grave backfill, but also the stuff that's left on and around the grave. Because actually one of the biggest problems that we encountered, and every gravedigger we spoke to said the same thing, And that was the stuff that people come and put on graves. Because obviously it's meant to be just a headstone. And, that's kind of what you do, and maybe the occasional bunch of flowers. But people, especially, and this is gets a bit more difficult, especially around children's graves, bring all sorts of things and leave them on the grave or leave them by the grave that they think that their children might appreciate, obviously, and so they get upset when they come back in a few weeks' time and all these things have been removed because it's the local authorities' regulations that they can't actually put all of these bits and pieces on and around the graves. Now, one of the things that they did say to us is that they're a bit more lenient with the graves for the younger children and babies. They tend to turn a blind eye and leave them there, not indefinitely, but leave them there for much longer than they would for adult graves. And that's one of the things that I thought was interesting, is the kind of stuff that you would find in and around graves when there are specific guidelines written in the cemetery books in terms of what you should and shouldn't have on the grave. It's just meant to be as a headstone and a bunch of flowers and maybe a wreath occasionally. But actually there's all sorts of what they call pound shop curios that now get put on graves, flashing stars and ornaments and Christmas decorations and all sorts. And the problem is as well, one of the biggest problems is that you've got wildlife in cemeteries. And so a lot of the time, it's not the grave diggers that have removed it. It's actually the wild animals that are present in the cemeteries that come along and eat the flowers, and the grave diggers get the blame for it.
I was going to say, Stuart, again, this was one of these like these time-wear narratives that came up again and again, because it was it said something. That there was the one about the deer, wasn't there?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody had complained to the quite vociferously, I think, to the cemetery that one of the grave diggers was going around deliberately trimming all the heads off the flowers. And I think the grave diggers had taken great delight because it was winter, so there was sort of heavy frost on the ground, and the grave digger took great delight in pointing out to this irate member of the public the little track of hoof prints going from one grave to next. And I know it probably sounds a bit flippant to put it like this, but again, occupational humour. It just reminds you that one person's heartfelt floral tribute is another cemetery uses all-you-can-eat buffet.
Yeah, because you've got deer in these cemeteries. So basically, deer come and eat the flowers. So it was a deer that were eating the heads off the flowers rather than being trimmed off by non-caring grave diggers. Yeah. So, there's all sorts of...
Mind you, I don't again, with my historian's hat on, I don't think this is an entirely new issue.
No.
Because one of the first sort of things, first little gems I found in the archives is an incident, I think, in the 1860s, actually, where a couple of, it's quite sad really, a couple of little girls had been apprehended and they were stealing the ribbons off the flowers to sell them.
Oh, wow.
So it just shows you these things go around. And the Victorians as well, they had these things called immortelles. I don't know if you've heard of those. They were like a ceramic wreath of flowers, and I think they were a bit sort of regarded as being a bit blingy, what we would call blingy at the time. And there were very much sort of people either liked them. They were the Victorian equivalent of this sort of pound shopification that Stuart's been talking about. And again, they tended to provoke quite strong reactions, shall we say, from some contemporary accommodators who claimed these ghastly, horrible things messing up the look of our lovely garden cemetery. So, again, these things go back.
It's just interesting to think about, from an archaeological, osteological point of view, how as we become more maybe regulated in certain things, either governmental law or individual to the cemeteries, that it would change our interpretation of the grave, because it's not necessarily this is how this person or their family wanted them to be buried. This is what the rules and regulations were about what they could and could not have in their grave with them or around their grave.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've only got to look at American cemeteries where the regulations can be a little bit more relaxed, where you've got, I saw one the other day where you literally had a Harley-Davidson literally sticking out deliberately of the top of the cemetery burial chamber, right? So essentially this person has had this huge concrete slab put over their tomb, yeah? And they've literally embedded within the memorial a full real Harley-Davidson, yeah, as part of their memorial. So basically, you have the seat, the tank, everything, literally, it's literally kind of rising up out of the grave. Yeah. So that was something that person obviously would. I've heard of people being buried completely. The person was, there's a story of a person actually being buried with his Porsche. Yeah. Literally the grave was dig. Let's start that again. The grave was the grave was dug big enough. This is what I say. The grave was dug big enough to allow a full-size car to be put in the grave with the person sat in the driver's seat. Yeah. So again, sometimes these remarkable high-status burials do occur, but that's going to take a lot of money and a lot of cemetery plots to bury an entire car. But it does happen. It does happen.
Yeah. I think also that question's reminded me of another big challenge for the cemetery staff, and particularly when they're working at older sites and maybe they're going back to do what they call a last one in, which is kind of what it says on the tin really, on an old grave, and they find that things are not as they expect, shall we say, because some of the older record keeping, and particularly pre the local cemeteries authorities order 1977, record keeping could sometimes be a bit hit and miss at some older sites. And also there was one site in our pilot sample where all the records actually got lost in a fire in the 1940s. So if you want a last one in there, you have to sign an indemnity, because they really don't know what they're going to find when they start digging. And sometimes they find, so for example, they might find a burial's not there that they expect, or conversely, they might find there's an extra one there, or it's too close to the surface to put another one in, or it doesn't meet modern regulations. So they have to do what's called capping with concrete, which is a whole then other level of complication and distress and reputational risk and so on. So there's a lot of emotional labour involved in this work as well.
Yeah, because basically when you open the grave, you dig down till you hit the top of the coffin, and then you put about an inch of soil between you and between the burial that's going in and the previous coffin. And if it's not down to 4 foot or 4'2", yeah, then you need to cap that grave, because obviously there's a regulation in terms of how deep that coffin needs to be. So you have to put a concrete cap over it if it's not deep enough. And obviously the thing is, if you've got 3 burials in that grave already, so it was 12 foot originally or 12'3" originally, yeah, and you dig down, you think you've got you hit the coffin at 2 foot down, it's not deep enough to put the next coffin in. So you have to cap it over with concrete, that's or you go back to the burial authority and say, the grave digger goes back and says the coffin's not going to fit in that grave. It's going to be like an inch below the soil. We're going to have to give them another grave to be buried in because it's not deep. Yeah, so basically that's what would happen. You either give them another grave gratis because you can't put another coffin in there, or you cap it with concrete. That's the only other solution. Yeah, because you can't have them just above the surface unless, as we found out from the natural burial guys, it is a natural burial where you're being buried in a woolen shawl or a willow coffin, something like that. And then the regulations are less stringent, yeah, closer to the surface, basically, which I find amazing. I'm still struggling with that whole close, but it is closer to the surface, yeah.
It's interesting. I would have thought it would be the other way around for some reason.
That's my feeling too. Absolutely. But as Helen's just explained, the medieval ancestors had a better understanding of, the decomposition much faster within a fairly shallowly buried interment. Yeah, apparently.
I've heard the medieval burial system. Paul Binsky speaks of it rather beautifully as a sacred recycling, which I think is lovely, and I think it speaks to those kind of more modern day, sort of more perhaps environmental sustainability kind of sensibilities, and it makes me think, when you're sort of thinking about time and history and so on, that actually it's more circular than linear, really, and we come back round, and maybe we're in a coming back round in terms of burial provision right now.
And I do wonder, Helen, if it's about not wishing other people to handle your mortal remains. Yeah. Is it
Possibly,
that
yeah.
you want to be put in a grave where you know that you're going to lay in that grave until resurrection? Yeah. And you just want if you're going to be dug up after 25 years and move to a charnel house and people are going to look after your mortal remains, yeah? Is it that you don't trust the cemetery to do that? Is it you don't, or is it about people handling your remains?
Oh gosh, that's a really deep question, and poor Megan's probably sat there thinking, but I had all these questions I want to ask them. So I just very well quickly say, I think it is something to do. I'm kind of working this out as I'm saying it here. I think it is something to do with increased secularization and different understandings of relationships between the body and soul.
Okay.
And I think as we have become a more secular society, there's increased focus on a sort of physical remains of the body, because I think, back in the olden days, if I may put it like that, when society generally was more religious, I think really what was important was what happened to the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And you had that whole sort of infrastructure of purgatory and prayers, and then that continues in folk custom after the Reformation, as some of my previous work has discussed. And I think that was really the focus. Whereas I think nowadays, because we don't have that whole kind of aspect of things as much anymore, certainly not in kind of mainstream culture, I think what happens to the body or doesn't happen to it has maybe become more important and more emotive. I don't know, but that's my hunch.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Maybe we'll have to write a paper on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, this is the sort of questions we're going to be having to ask people in terms of if we're going to persuade people that an ossuary, or is a good idea. These are the sorts of questions I'm sure people are going to ask us. So these are the sorts of questions we need to know the answer to.
Exactly. So Megan, as you can see, this is kind of how the research process happens, that we kick ideas around like this.
Well, it does make sense that if you want to address people's concerns about like changing burial practices, you need to first understand why they prefer the burial practices we currently have, and like,
absolutely,
is there aspects of that like you can keep, but maybe make it better or more space efficient?
Yes,
and it often does have a logic. It's not necessarily the logic that sort of political authorities might want or need, but there's often logic there. You've just got to get to it.
Yeah, why don't you want that to happen? That's the kind of question that I'm sure we're going to be asked. Yeah, and actually, this is the questions that we're going to have to put to the burial authorities. It's like, can you envisage us getting a local authority to introduce a charnel house, or an ossuary, because it would be great to see it happen, but somebody's got to be brave enough to say, that's a great idea, let's do it. Yeah. But then you've got to train the staff to take the bodies out of the ground. At what point do you remove the body from the ground and put it into the ossuary? And that's going to be very, very varied, because that will be reliant on the soil conditions in that particular cemetery. So you're going to need a geologist to help with us understanding how the body decays. And these are the sorts of things that I'm sure archaeologists are going to be dealing with in the future.
I think what we found in the pilot study, and bear in mind this was a few years ago now, so there's now a longitudinal aspect to this as well. I think what we found in the pilot was that those skills, like Stuart mentioned, like exhumations, they are still there, but they are disappearing quite fast now. So this is why, if we're asking the question, why this research at this time, we need to capture that, that informal, unwritten kind of ground up, if you'll excuse the phrasing, knowledge while it's still there, and record it. I think it was quite interesting interviews, actually, when I look back, that when we asked the grave diggers who'd been in service, sort of 20, 30 years, they absolutely got why we were asking them about hand digging, and they were happy to talk about it, and they saw it they'd really thought about it, as a tribute of care. When we asked some of the younger guys, I think they were a bit baffled about why we were even asking them. So, even you're seeing that generational step change in progress right as we speak.
And they were like, but it's always been dug by machines. We're like, no, it hasn't. It has not been dug by machines. It's only been dug by machines the last 20 years. Oh, that's ages ago,
But yeah, it's what people know. I mean, we did speak actually to a retired graver who sadly has since himself died. And his experience went right back into the early 1970s, which was great for us because actually that's where structural changes within the way that local authorities organise things meant that the archival material stopped being nearly as useful. So we've just about managed to get back. There's a slightly hazy period, I'd say, in the late 60s, early 70s. But we've kind of managed to establish that thread of continuity going right back since the records began.
Yeah. It's one of those things as well that, like, you talk to people, I'm sure, with your work, like a lot of this has to do with you saying, like, people don't want to be dug up, but like, why don't you want to be dug up? And they think when they're buried, they're going to stay buried forever. But like, I'm an archaeologist. I dig up dead people all the time. I dig up even like very recently not dead people. Like the last excavation I was on was like 1840s, I think. Now that's rare for us, but still, like, those people definitely thought when they were going in the ground they were staying there forever. And I'm like, no, you're in my warehouse now.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you hope, and I'm sure the company you work for does treat them with the respect that they deserve. Yeah. And obviously that's one of the things I was saying is it's about treating those individuals with respect and the respect. And actually that's one of the reasons why an ossuary or a charnel house would be a great idea, because basically that it's going to be within the cemetery. It will be, in the grounds that you were buried in. That's the place that you chose to be buried. Yeah. So if resurrection does happen to be true, religiously, then those people are going to be resurrected in the place where they chose to be buried, and I'm sure they'd be delighted by that. But regardless of the resurrection thing, basically, if I'm hoping that a local authority will take the bull by the horns and just say, this is a great idea. Let's try an ossuary. And as I say, it's not unusual practice in European cemeteries. They have them, We still have two in this country. There's one in Sheffield. There's a really well-known ossuary in Sheffield. Yeah, where they were still taking care of the remains, those bones, in the 1970s, and then the practice died out. And it wasn't until Lizzie, one of our archaeological colleagues in Sheffield, found out about that ossuary and started to, ask questions of whether it still existed, whether people were taking care of it. Basically, it started that whole process again. And actually, there's a whole study about the ossuary there, and the people are now still taking care and going in and dusting the remains and looking after them and taking care of those burials.
And actually, there's been a string in recent years of rediscoveries of old ossuaries that were kind of mothballed. So in the sort of religious and political uncertainty of the Reformation, when people didn't know whether they were going to be Protestant or Catholic, people kind of kept the options open by mothballing their ossuaries, and which was a very sensible strategy in the context of the time. And then these things just got quietly forgotten about, but sometimes they get rediscovered, or we find antiquarian accounts of people in the past who've rediscovered them. And it's been really exciting, actually, because again, it gives weight to this case that we want to make for that reintroduction of channeling.
And if you look sorry, go on.
Sorry, I'm going to say when you were talking, Stuart, about this notion of respect, so it's something that increasingly interests me, actually, because we talk about this thing like respect for the dead, like it's some sort of timeless absolute, and I'm not sure it is. I think actually it can change over time and across place, and so I think what we're probably going to be doing in our future research is sort of trying to shift those notions of respect and shift the dial on that a bit, and what respect means in practice. And perhaps, it doesn't actually mean leaving people in a grave forever.
Yeah, it's just like the charnel houses seem like a good idea, not only because it saves space in the now for, people, but also just, again, from an archaeological point of view, that like eventually everything will get built over. But maybe if they're sort of protected in a charnel house, like you're more likely to build around that versus like a giant field that is a cemetery. It's like, I can't really build around that though. Like I need to build on top of that. Whereas if you've compiled it all in a smaller space, like same number of people to smaller space, they, there might be sort of some leadway there that you can kind of do it. But I think respect also is very important. We're always acutely aware when we're working that we're working with people, and that these people probably did not want to be dug up, especially not the way that we have to do it in sort of a conservation sort of way. So we always try and treat it with a lot of respect. But again, you're taking people out of what they would have presumed would be their last resting place, and it's not always a great solution, but it is the only solution.
You've also reminded me as well, Megan, about this question of not just what we do with the future dead, but what do we do with the cemetery sites that we already have? And that's a whole other set of questions we probably haven't got time to go into tonight. But that's something we may find ourselves looking at as well.
But it does make you wonder, Megan, basically, you say that these people had anticipated it being their final resting place. Did they really think that, Or did they really, at the back of their mind, think, oh, we're buying this cemetery plot for permission to bury. We've got it for 25 years. Did they really think that it was going to happen? Do they think that resurrection was going to happen sometime soon? Yeah. It does make you wonder. It's like, are we still waiting for that resurrection to happen? It does make you question these things, doesn't it? It's like, why did we get this Victorian viewpoint that in perpetuity meant forever? Yeah. Basically you were buying this plot to be buried in for a long, long time in perpetuity. Where did that come from?
I think there are a couple of things to that, perhaps. And I think one is that, we often think of the Victorian period as, sort of industry and commerce and, what William Morris called the snorting steam and the piston stroke. But actually it was also a very religious and indeed very superstitious time as well. So let's not forget that. And I think also it's a question of perspective, because I think, from the perspective of an individual life, thinking, oh yeah, I'll be buried for the next 100 years, it'll be fine, seems like a long time. But of course, from the perspective of history and of archaeology, 100 years is very little time at all. So maybe there's an element of that as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, chatting with you guys has also made me rethink of a different excavation I was on years ago that I think they'd decided it was medieval. They were still a little unsure when I was there. But a lot of the graves were like intercutting each other. So at some point, someone had come in, cut the legs off one person, making a grave for the next person. And it makes you think, like, if they knew that was happening, did they then also not think like that this would be their eternal resting place because it wasn't for the guy under them. Like he got his legs cut off to make room for me. So it's interesting to think about that as well.
I think people have an incredible capacity, and this is something I see in funeral rituals, past and present all the time. People have an incredible capacity to believe contradictory things at the same time. I mean, I think it was Lewis Carroll said about, Alice in Wonderland believing seven marvellous and contradictory things before breakfast. And the human brain does that. There's a name for it. It's ludic, or the ludicrous. We have that incredible ability to do that as human beings.
It'll be fine. But isn't it? It'll be fine. It'll
That's
be fine.
very deep, isn't it?
Yeah, it'll be fine. Yeah, it's true, isn't it? It's like, I'm sure nothing will happen to my grave. Yeah, because I'm special.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Also, I think someone once said this to me, and I think it's true. When people say they're afraid of death, generally they're not afraid of death. They're afraid of dying.
Mm-hmm.
They're not so afraid of what happens after because they're not going to be there to experience it. So maybe there's an element of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That makes sense. So I'm aware that I've kept you here for a long time, but I could keep chatting to you forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you must tell the people that you feel they need to know?
I think one of the things that I would like to get your listeners to think about is their own funeral customs and their own funeral, what they want. Yeah. And actually, you don't always have to go with a burial authority. You've got an option to go and be buried be buried to a ritual and a plot of your choosing if you think about it soon enough. So you can make plans. So I would say, I suppose, thinking about the future, plan what you want to happen to your mortal remains. Yeah, before the 11th hour, is what I would suggest. So I've got a colleague who has already bought their plot in Armorsvale Cemetery. They know where they know where they're going to be buried. They know where their wife is going to be buried as well, along with them. So they're very happy with that solution. Yeah, they know exactly what they want. They know where they're going to be, for eternity, as far as they're concerned. But I think, basically think about, don't be afraid to think about it. For me personally, I don't care where I go. I've got that archaeological perspective. If you just chuck me in a ditch, I'd be fine, because I'm not there anymore. I've passed on, so it doesn't matter to me. If you want to put me in a charnel house, that's absolutely fine by me. It doesn't make any difference to me. But, I've got that kind of archaeological viewpoint on what's going to happen to my remains because I don't care. I won't be there anymore. But think about what you personally want in terms of what's going to happen to your remains. And I think that may help to take the pressure off the local authorities who are struggling to think about what they're going to do beyond 20 years.
Yeah? That makes sense. I did have, as I said, a hyper focus about my own funeral once a few years ago, and I planned out the whole thing. I'm going in a natural cemetery. I'm going to be a tree. I told my mum, she stole the idea, and my dad just presumes he's going in next to my mum. So we've got it all sorted.
Perfect.
I don't know where my brother's going, but that's not my problem.
Helen, have you got anything?
I was going to say what you said, Stuart. I think you've put it absolutely perfectly, and I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, so I guess the only other thing I would say is, we are having conversations with the government authorities to try to make people more aware of the options and also to make people more aware of ossuaries and actually authorities to make people aware of ossuaries that, we need to go to a more European model. Yeah. We need to think about Greece and Spain. They've got ossuaries. They've got different types of burial. So we need to kind of look at what the Europeans have been doing for the last 150 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And what we used to do 400 or 500 years ago.
Absolutely. If we want to improve what we do and actually, stop trying to build new municipal cemeteries. Yeah. I'm not trying to take the thunder from the municipal cemeteries, but it's been a useful engine for the past 100 years. But we need to rethink that whole process about death and burial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if anyone wants to follow up with either of you or to learn more, where can they reach out?
So, we've written some papers on this. Yeah. So if you wanted to learn more, there's some papers that we've published. Helen's got a book on death and burial. So you can have a read of Helen's work, the papers that we've already produced, or I'm perfectly happy to get emails from members of the public to my university email address. Yeah, so I'm happy to speak to people.
Yeah, you can find me on academia.edu. I'm always very happy to come out, do talks on all sorts of aspects of past and present funeral customs. So yeah, do reach out.
Yeah, and the same applies here as well. We're happy to do more. We'd love to come back and speak to you guys again. So I'm happy to do a repeat performance at some point.
We can let you know how our research gets on.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, that would be great. I haven't scared them off. Woo.
No. It's great, Megan. It's great. It's been great.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to link all your papers and your book and the academia website all in the show notes in the description so everyone can find those. Thank you to Stuart and Helen for being on. And thank you to the listeners. I will see you or hear you all in next week's episode. Bye, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.